Yassas. Welcome to Greek Like Me, the podcast about all things Greek. I'm your host, Pamela Diodes Wood. Email us at stealthgreek@gmail.com to share comments, questions, and stories about Greekness, or your own ethnic background. This is our much-delayed second episode on Greeks and the Civil Rights Movement. Part 1 aired on March 7th. If you missed it, you might want to go back and listen. Quick recap. We did a brief background on Greeks in America and the precarious position they were in as a barely tolerated ethnic group in the southern states, and talked about the blatant racism targeting Black Americans in the U.S., particularly in the South. We introduced the man championing Greek support for Black Americans and civil rights, Archbishop Iakovos, may his memory be eternal. Head of the Greek Orthodox Church of North and South America from 1959 to 1996. The abuses he suffered on his home island of Imbros under Turkish rule compelled him to take a stand on civil rights in America. The Archbishop encouraged American Greeks to vote and advocate for Black Americans by rejecting segregation and supporting equal rights. In-house at first, for fear of retaliation from racist white Southerners, which would result in physical assault and Greek businesses being boycotted, trashed, or burned to the ground. Lastly, in Episode 1, we remembered the brutal violence inflicted on Black Americans in the South as they marched for civil rights, including the monstrous bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, where 4 children were killed on September 15, 1963, during Sunday morning church services. Archbishop Iakovos joined clergy, businessmen, politicians, and celebrities, signing a public statement protesting the violence and supporting civil rights. In today's episode, this man of conscience continues to push the Greek Orthodox faithful in America to take a stand for justice. We'll also touch on the church today on equal rights. In April 1964, Archbishop Iakovos encouraged the Standing Conference of Canonical Orthodox Bishops, including 10 bishops from various patriarchates of Orthodoxy, to issue a public statement declaring the constitutionally and spiritually guaranteed rights which no man can be denied because of color or creed. On July 2nd, President Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act into law. It had taken forever to get through Congress. U.S. presidents don't just get to sign laws. Congress has to do its part first, voting in favor of a bill before it can move to the president's desk. The Civil Rights Act prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or nation origin. Days later, over the Independence Day holiday, the annual Clergy Laity Congress of the Greek Orthodox Church of America convened, and civil rights was on the agenda. The Clergy Laity Congress brings together church leaders, priests, and lay delegates from churches throughout the Archdiocese to discuss matters affecting their parishes and the church's mission. So people are gathering from all over the country. The 1964 Clergy Laity Congress adopted the resolution of the Conference of Canonical Orthodox Bishops as the official position on civil rights for the Church in America, equal rights for all Americans. Archbishop Iakovos saw the Clergy Laity Congress as an opportunity to educate and inform attendees. Quote, "We do not simply celebrate and commemorate Independence Day this year. We implement and enrich its meaning with the signing of the Civil Rights Bill. A rekindled spirit of 1776 and of 1863 is brightening the horizon of the world with refreshing hope that justice and equality for all men, regardless of race, color, and creed, shall fill the hearts of men." 1863 references the passage of the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed enslaved people in America. Iakovos introduced a new Committee on Social and Moral Issues, responsible for publicizing important issues like civil rights throughout the Archdiocese and educating the communicants. The entire Greek Orthodox population in America was being educated, from the clergy down to the children in Sunday school. This education continues on the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of America website, goarch.org, and in encyclicals from the current Archbishop Elpidophoros. And the connection between the Greek Orthodox Church and the Greek people in America is unbelievably close, even for those who are not particularly religious. So when the church is involved in something, the Greek people in America are involved in something. Later that month, July 1964, the Archbishop spoke at the dedication ceremony of the 1964 New York World's Fair, and again took the moral high ground. Quote, "The New York World's Fairgrounds offers us the battleground for a new and concerted effort to overcome bigotry and division and serve God's people as God's servants." The point of the World's Fair was to connect with others representing their countries and cultures and gain some understanding and respect. It wasn't just about robots and moving sidewalks. In August, the Archbishop released an encyclical on the civil rights law. It is the duty of the clergy to enlighten and try to convince the Christians we serve that the enforcement of this law is their sacred obligation. Equality is not a political doctrine. It is a Christian axiom based on the Bible, taught and reinforced by Jesus Christ, who never practiced discrimination, political, social, or religious. He made it plain it is our duty as Christians to support equality. Iakovos called voting in America a sacred trust and urged religious leaders of all backgrounds to convince their followers to vote for what was right. Blacks in the American South were still mostly unable to vote, even though they legally had the right, because racist state and municipal governments placed heavy restrictions on Black voters that whites never had to face. They were forced to pay poll taxes. They had to pay to vote. They had to take literacy tests, while illiterate whites were allowed to make their mark on a ballot. Black Americans were tested on the U.S. government or obscure local laws. Obviously, white voters were not subject to the same strictures because many still don't understand how their government works. In municipalities throughout the South, polls were open when civil authorities knew most Black folks were at work, while white citizens were frequently given time off by their employers to make sure they voted the right way. Do you wonder why the U.S. doesn't give its citizens the day off so we can all vote? I do. Black voters were threatened, intimidated, and sometimes beaten to keep them away from the polls. The Civil Rights Act was taken as an unwelcome suggestion by many in Southern communities. The battle for equal rights in the U.S. was heating up. In the midst of this, Archbishop Iakovos was trying to fulfill his commitment to elevating recognition of the Greek Orthodox community and helping them assimilate as accepted members of American society. Speaking out for civil rights had the potential to quash the status of Greeks still struggling to be accepted by white Americans. But Iakovos felt conscience-driven to push for something he was unable to in his birthplace, a God-given mandate to fight for freedom and equality for everyone. Black citizens in Alabama participated in a peaceful march for voting rights in February 1965. They were challenged by Alabama state troopers who attacked them using clubs, cattle prods, and guns. This was caught on camera. You can Google it. Some were chased, including a protester who sought refuge in a cafe with his family. Police officers caught up with them. Black customers eating their meals, sitting there eating their meals, were beaten by the police. Jimmy Lee Jackson was shot trying to protect his mother and died 8 days later. Another nonviolent march was quickly organized by the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, an Atlanta-based civil rights group founded by Black pastors. The planned route was from Selma to the state courthouse in Montgomery, with the hope of speaking to then-Governor George Wallace about Jackson's death. March 7th. Hundreds of Black protesters walked peacefully towards the Edmund Pettus Bridge, which would carry them to their destination. Alabama law enforcement again attacked violently, severely injuring a number of people. This time, the state police force was augmented with a volunteer posse, some on horseback, who assaulted marchers with bullwhips, rubber tubing wrapped in barbed wire, and clubs. Again, caught on film. March 7th became known as Bloody Sunday for the unprovoked violence ending the march. 2 days later, Dr. King led another march along the same path, only to be blocked again by Alabama authorities threatening violence. Dr. King and other clergy, including a handful of white Protestant ministers, knelt in prayer before Dr. King led them back to Selma. That night, members of the Ku Klux Klan crossed paths with Reverend James Reeb, a white minister from up north, and 2 of his colleagues. The ministers were beaten viciously for marching with protesters. Reverend Reeb was killed. The killing of a white minister received national attention. Archbishop Yakovos sent a telegram to Reeb's widow, telling her that her husband had died heroically on the battlefield of mankind. Dr. King organized a memorial march for March 15th that would travel from Brown Chapel AME Church in Selma to the Montgomery Courthouse. He sent out a plea to American religious leaders to join him. The Archbishop's advisors warned him not to go. They feared the threat of violence was too great. Taylor Branch, in his acclaimed biography of Martin Luther King, stated another risk. The Archbishop went against the advice of his clergy and staff, who worried correctly he would be called traitor to the quest of marginalized Greeks for full acceptance as Americans. The Archbishop, Chancellor Father George Bokopoulos, and several other priests joined him. Yakovos asked 2 Greek Orthodox priests in Alabama, including Father Juvelis, who we met in episode 1, to meet him at Brown Chapel. Father Juvelis took heat from some of his congregation for promoting equal rights, but didn't hesitate to join in. The pilot flying the Archbishop and 21 other members of the clergy from New York was afraid to set down near Selma. Instead, they landed in a nearby cow pasture where the clergy disembarked. Yakovos was the highest-ranking clergyman of any denomination present. As co-president of the World Council of Churches, vice president of the National Council of Churches, he was where America would take notice. Over 3,000 people marched past angry, racist whites lining the streets, screaming obscenities and threats. Yakovos later told the New York Times, "As we walked toward the courthouse, there were so many ugly faces staring at us. The white spirits were so poisoned by hate and bias." Marchers sang "We Shall Overcome" all the way to the courthouse doors, which had been locked against them. Dr. King laid a wreath in honor of Reverend Reeb against the locked courthouse door. The Archdiocese website notes it wasn't lost on the Greeks that if a Greek immigrant, even an archbishop, had marched a few decades earlier, he would have been deported. In his hotel room, Yakovos received threatening phone calls, told he'd be shot, that the hotel he was staying in would be burned to the ground with him in it. When asked why he'd participated, Yakovos told reporters the march had been, quote, an appropriate occasion not only to dedicate myself and the Greek Orthodox communicants to the noble cause for which Reverend Reeb gave his life, but also to show willingness to continue this fight against prejudice, bias, and persecution. Our church and our people fully understand from our heritage and tradition such sacrificial involvements. Our church has never hesitated to fight for the rights of mankind. We have fought oppressive and repressive regimes for centuries. A Christian must cry out in indignation against all persecution. President Johnson announced his support for the Voting Rights Bill, which would end state and municipal obstacles to black voters. On national radio, the Archbishop congratulated the president, reminding Americans that events in Alabama damaged the image of the U.S. Yakovos' encyclical following the march called on Greek Orthodox clergy to explain the importance of the Selma protest to their congregations and urged them to support voting rights legislation in accordance with biblical exhortation, may all be one. The Archbishop next traveled to a South Carolina parish. No one met him at the airport. I cannot begin to explain how unheard of this is. Everyone is expected to, everyone wants to greet the Archbishop when he visits. He was called proloti, traitor. He said he was told, I should be ashamed of what I had done, that I'm not an American, that I am not a Christian. And oh my gosh, all of this seems so familiar right now. During an interview with a South Carolina TV station, the Archbishop said, the clergy of all religions, quote, have the duty to serve our country through serving citizens who are deprived of essential rights. Religion must pursue to the end this cause for equality and dignity for all Americans. Branch describes the Archbishop's evening, alone in a Charleston hotel room, stripped of accustomed pomp, telling hostile callers he was compelled to Selma by formative memories of Greek suffering under the harsh occupation of the Turks. Athanasios Yamenos, author of the African-American Civil Rights Movement and Archbishop Iakavos of North and South America, says Iakavos received overwhelming support from his congregants for exhibiting orthodox commitment by showing active interest in the welfare of humankind. But he also received letters lamenting reprisals suffered because of him. Restaurant owners were losing business. People were being rude to the Greeks. Yamenos says Iakavos was dismayed that some of his own people ignored or underestimated the effects of discrimination. Discrimination they themselves were obviously still experiencing. A letter from Birmingham, Alabama informed Iakavos, our community suffered not only economic reprisals by the Anglo-Saxon and overwhelmingly Protestant community of Birmingham, but our community itself was deeply, almost irrevocably splintered because of your ill-timed quasi-political visit to Selma. A splintered community indicates many of the congregants sided with the Archbishop. The wife of a church leader wrote to remind Iakavos Greeks in the South were a minority, and, quote, most of them make their living from rednecks, who are the ruling majority. Anything we do down here is overly exaggerated in the press, and the rednecks take this for an excuse to abuse our people. It was scary times. Father Juvelis reported a number of bomb threats against Greek churches in Alabama. 4 bombs had been found. There were telegrams demanding to know if the Archbishop had any idea how long and how much effort it had taken for the Greek community to finally come to relatively good relations with the white Protestants of Alabama. The president of the Parish Council of Montgomery wrote that Iakavos put Greeks in a serious position with respect to our fellow white citizenry with whom we've lived for many decades. Chanimo, if they considered you white, they wouldn't be hassling you. They didn't march against other Anglos when the white Protestant clergy marched in Daxi. One writer had the maracas to protest the effort to give the vote to the semi-civilized, remembering the marchers weren't the ones chasing people down with bullwhips and bats. The president and secretary of the Charleston Church in South Carolina were dismayed Iakavos marched with beatniks. Probably my favorite. During this pushback, the Fraternal Order of AHEPA, the American Hellenic Educational Progressive Association, supported the Archbishop. AHEPA endorsed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act, which passed in August 1965, after having campaigned for the passage of both. AHEPA was founded in 1922 in Atlanta, 40 years earlier, to combat the attacks of the KKK against Greeks. Yet conservative Greeks today point to immigrants like their parents and people of color as the enemy. The National Herald, the Greek-American daily newspaper, endorsed equal rights and Archbishop Iakavos' actions. So the main voices of the Greek community in America, the Archbishop, EHEPA, the Council of Orthodox Bishops, the clergy laity, and the Greek American daily newspaper, all endorsed civil rights and the end of segregation and racist persecution against Black Americans. On March 26, 1965, Life magazine published the famous cover, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on the courthouse steps in Montgomery, Alabama, holding the memorial wreath for Reverend Reeb. Standing beside him is Archbishop Iakovos. Andrew M. Manis, in Religion, Belonging, and Social Mobility in Civil Rights Era Birmingham, Alabama, says the Greek mamas of Birmingham reacted by sending their kids to the local newsstands to buy up every copy of the magazine before the rednecks saw it. Iakovos was baffled by these reactions. Father Michael Varlamos, author of A Quest for Human Rights and Civil Rights, Archbishop Iakovos in the Greek Orthodox Church, says Iakovos empathized with the plight of African Americans and believed most Greek Americans would empathize with them as well. He knew the concepts of freedom, justice, and equality, first articulated by the ancient Greeks, remained embedded in Greek culture. He says Iakovos saw a parallel between the fight for freedom and equality for African Americans in the United States with the Greeks' eternal pursuit of freedom. Greek Orthodoxy teaches about the inherent dignity that all humans possess. The Archbishop continued to instruct his clergy to impart these ideas and implore their parishes to re-embrace them. Manis writes, the progressive priests and archbishop tried to call them back where they could remember whence they had come. And he adds, Father Juvelis continued to challenge his congregants in Birmingham to understand their Orthodox faith and Greek traditions in ways that supersede even the power of race in the South and in American culture. In time, the hard cases in his church stopped demanding his resignation or reassignment, enlightened perhaps by the reminder of treasured Greek values. The race riots of the 60s began as younger, often poorer members of the Black population became increasingly frustrated at the struggle for equal rights. Each riot was triggered by an act of violence by police or white racists against a member of the Black community. Then 1967 saw an increase in racial violence and riots, creating a climate of fear and anger in the white community. White flight made headlines. Archbishop Iakovos remained committed to civil rights. In his March 1968 encyclical, he wrote, "Our greatest and most precious inheritance from Christianity and Hellenism, freedom that rejects all compromise of political, social, or religious untruths, it steadfastly wills spiritual, moral, political, social, and religious growth and improvement under the watchful eye of God." Yamenos explains that historically, the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese is fundamentally in favor of justice and equality and against violence and coercion. Based on values of love and forgiveness, it fights against oppressive structures of domination. Martin Luther King was assassinated on April 4th, 1968, unleashing even greater frustration and anger in the Black community. The Archbishop released a statement. Martin Luther King was the symbol of a justified struggle for civil rights. He was a martyr on behalf of peace. Iakovos instructed Greek churches to remain open that day so the faithful may pray for the eternal repose of Dr. Martin Luther King. He was one of many religious leaders attending Dr. King's funeral at Ebenezer Baptist Church. Soon after, the National Conference of Bishops issued a press release urging Congress to provide funds to support the Economic Opportunity Act, whose purpose was to improve conditions for people still being crippled by racism. This was unanimously endorsed by the Standing Conference of Canonical Orthodox Bishops in the Americas. Archbishop Iakovos became co-chairman of the Martin Luther King Jr. Interreligious Memorial Fund. At the 1970 Greek Orthodox Clergy Lady Congress in Atlanta, the Archbishop reminded the gathering that true Orthodox Christianity is moral integrity, unblemished love, and social justice. He led 150 church delegates to visit Dr. King's tomb at Ebenezer Baptist Church. Yakovos laid a wreath saying, "We come to pray so that his dream, only partially fulfilled, may someday be fully realized." Yakovos presented a $5,000 check from the Archdiocese to the Martin Luther King Jr. Center for Nonviolent Social Change, saying, "The Church must not be passive, but militant when protecting humanity's freedom, justice, dignity, and equality." In 1984, the Archbishop lobbied his congressional contacts to vote for the Martin Luther King Day bill, believing King's birthday should be celebrated as a day of freedom, like the 4th of July or Greek Independence Day. He said, "The remembrance of that day fills the souls of all with hope that equality, justice, and freedom will reign supreme if we pursue the legacy of Martin Luther King with vigilance." When Martin Luther King Day was declared a national holiday, Mrs. King asked Archbishop Yakovos to address the National Press Club in the U.S. Capitol for the official announcement. The Archbishop continued to recognize, join in prayer services, and encourage the Greek Orthodox in recognizing Martin Luther King Day and continuing to fight for justice for the Black community. Metropolitan Silas of New Jersey delivered a message to the Greek churches in 1986 from Yakovos. His Eminence has asked the Greek Orthodox faithful to affirm their commitment to peace, unity, and racial harmony. The 1988 Clergy Laity Congress unanimously adopted a resolution on political and racial justice. By 1996, the white supremacy movement in America raised its ugly head again, triggering a rampage of church burnings in the South. 57 Black churches burned and vandalized. Archbishop Yakovos held a public divine liturgy in Central Park in New York City, attended by 12,000 people. In his sermon, he said, "Some people throughout our nation are busy burning churches belonging to Black citizens. It's a shame hatred still fills the divided souls of some miserable citizens. This should inspire us to practice what they don't and to come to the assistance of our brethren and help them rebuild." He announced the Burned Churches Fund, directing every parish in the Archdiocese to take collections to support it. Unfortunately, some American Greeks have turned their back on the Hellenic belief in freedom for all and the Greek Orthodox mandate of equality. But the foundation Archbishop Yakovos lay is still strong with our people. In 2013, a HEPA partnered with the NAACP to combat racism. On March 7, 2015, then Archbishop Dimitrios walked across the Edmund Pettus Bridge with President Obama and other civic and religious leaders to commemorate the 50th anniversary of Bloody Sunday. Dimitrios said, "The promotion and protection of civil rights transcends politics, since the ability to determine one's future is a God-given blessing." A 2020 speech by New York State Senator Andrew Gonardes during the pushback against Black Lives Matter reminded Greeks to empathize with the communities suffering because of their ethnicity. "Bigotry and discrimination," he said, "are not the values of our community that allowed us to be successful. Instead, we must remember the struggles of those who came before us and open our hearts to all those stories that mirror ours." Most Greeks and Greek Orthodox during the 1960s supported civil rights for citizens who were being bullied, oppressed, and denied basic rights because of the color of their skin. Archbishop Yakovos lobbied, protested, engaged with the government, and led his people with calls for direct action. He gave them tangible arenas for becoming part of the solution. I never realized the extent of his mission to capture and focus the faith and actions of our community in participating in righting a great wrong. The Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of America has continued to participate, even if some of her congregates have forgotten to listen. These issues continue, evidenced by the appalling deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Tyree Nichols, and many others. On June 3, 2020, current Archbishop Elpidophoros followed in the footsteps of his predecessor, marching in Brooklyn with Black Lives Matter to protest the continuing deaths of Black people at the hands of police, vigilantes, and racists. The Archbishop said, "I came to Brooklyn to stand in solidarity with my sisters and brothers whose rights have been sorely abused. We must speak and speak loudly against injustice in our country. It is our moral duty and obligation to uphold the sanctity of every human being. We have faced a pandemic of grave physical illness, but the spiritual illness in our land runs even deeper and must be healed by actions as well as words. I will continue to stand with all who are committed to preserving peace, justice, and equality for every citizen, regardless of their race, religion, gender, or ethnic origin." He was vilified by many Greeks for marching with a Marxist organization, a label right-wing extremists use referring to anyone they dislike or who wishes to improve their lot in the U.S. or who disagrees with them, including Greeks back in the day. We'll finish with the work of some modern Greek American scholars studying the weird dynamic of Greeks in racist America. Some quotes are edited for time constraints. The Yale Macmillan Center convened a panel of scholars in March 2021 to discuss the history of Greek and Black American relationships before, during, and after the Civil Rights Movement and, quote, their configuration during the Trump presidency and BLM movement. I saw this well after the event, and I'm trying to get a hold of the transcript. Of particular interest was this part of the event description. The reactionary dismissal of Black Lives Matter among conservative Greek Americans on social media embraced the All Lives Matter mantra by referencing their own slavery under the Ottoman Empire. And how do these Greeks think their ancestors, slaves of the Ottomans, would have felt protesting the murders, tortures, and disappearances of the Greek people in the belief that Greek lives mattered, only to be told by the pashas, all lives matter? It's hypocritical to complain about the wrongs done to your own people and turn your back when it happens to others. In 2020, Dr. George Demakopoulos and Dr. Aristotele Papanikolaou tell us the fathers of the church were constantly fighting against poverty and oppression. This goes all the way back to the beginning. The writers hail Archbishop Iakovos and defend Archbishop Elpidophoros in their article, Orthodox Christianity, Systemic Racism, and the Wrong Side of History. Quote, "For Orthodox Christians, the most meaningful takeaway from Black Lives Matter is that whites of all ethnicities are challenged to imagine what it is like to live in a Black body in a country with our slave history, more likely to be profiled, less likely to get a job, to live in a body that fears being killed by the police. That kind of imagination is our Christian calling. As Orthodox Christians, it is our spiritual challenge. But too many Orthodox Christians would rather deflect, deny, and ignore because we fear genuine equality for Black people would come at our expense." They continue, saying, Iakovos' march alongside Martin Luther King is regarded as one of the iconic moments of Orthodox Christianity. Today, we ignore or apologize for that generation of Orthodox who did not understand the moral necessity of the civil rights movement. As a Christian raised in Turkey, Elpidophoros experienced structural oppression in ways most Americans can only imagine. History has shown Iakovos was right to have marched at Selma. It will also prove Archbishop Elpidophoros right for walking in Brooklyn. They end by saying, what will our grandchildren say about us 50 years from now? Scholars studying the bizarre phenomenon of Greek racism call it reverse empathy. The Yale Macmillan panel states historical analogies between Greek and African American experience of oppression have been mobilized paradoxically to justify a dismissal or at least indifference to calls for the recognition, condemnation, and eradication of systemic racism. So conservative Greeks use the parallel of Greek suffering to dismiss the suffering of Black Americans because Greeks are doing pretty good right now in America. So Black people, come on, get over it. It was 400 years ago. But our people, we're still talking about what happened to us hundreds of years ago. In Recollecting Greek America, Reflections on Ethnic Struggle, Success, and Survival, Yorgos Anagnostou speaks to the same issue. He cites the many civil rights activists in the Greek community at all levels of society: working class, professional, clergy, institutions, artists, and more. And he examines the growth of so-called conservatism as it has come to mean lack of inclusiveness. He says, European Americans acquiesce to racial hierarchies and collectively reap the benefits of whiteness. Ethnic success cannot be divorced from European American consent to racial domination. Those in control in this country chose who they would let in on their ladder of success, who they would allow to consider themselves white, based on how well those immigrants conformed to the American vision as they dictated it and are still dictating it. And because it now conveniently bolsters their numbers of whiteness against people of color, where before we weren't white and we were the undesirables breeding too quickly. Many Greeks remember where we came from and the damage exclusion and bigotry can inflict on generations. The Orthodox Church in America and those who follow Orthodox doctrine continue to engage and support those being slighted in America, including the Black community. Author of Greek American Struggle and Success, sociology professor Charles Moscas Jr. says, it's important for all of us to begin to live the principles we profess to cherish. Anthony Balouris, a fellow at the UN for the Department of Inter-Orthodox, Ecumenical, and Interfaith Relations, wrote, as Orthodox Christians, we are charged with viewing people of all races equally, both under God as well as society. To me, our collective Greek-American conscience continues to reach back to the truth espoused by Iakovos, who says, we cannot be Christians in name and not in spirit and action. Mrs. King said, at a time when many of the nation's most prominent clergy were silent, Archbishop Iakovos courageously supported our freedom movement against poverty, racism, and violence. Iakovos said of his activism, I was not born in a just democracy. I came from Turkey, where I was a third-category citizen. I decided to take revenge against all those who oppress people. I will stand for rights, civil and human, as long as I live. I feel it a Christian duty and a duty of a man who was born a slave. In his farewell address at his last Clergy Lady Congress in 1996, Archbishop Iakovos proves he was the GOAT, saying, being committed to peace with all religions and to the eradication of bigotry, discrimination, injustice, violence, and racial hatred, the march in Selma, Alabama will continue to pave the way along the frontiers of unity and social justice. Ours is a commitment to true Christianity, to true justice, to the liberation of people still oppressed, to true peace. There's much more to say about Archbishop Iakovos and Greek Americans in the Civil Rights Movement and Orthodoxy supportive equal rights. We've barely scratched the surface. If you're interested in learning more about Orthodox activism in America, there's a video series sponsored by the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of America called A Conversation on Racial Reconciliation. It's available on the goarc.org website and on YouTube. Its purpose is to initiate and facilitate conversations about racial issues so Orthodox faithful can educate themselves. The Racial Reconciliation page on the website has a reading list, so check it out. We'll post a link in the podcast notes. Another ongoing video series on the GoArc website or YouTube is Black American Orthodox Experience from the Orthodox Christian Network, or OCN. Black Americans share their experiences as Americans of color and as Orthodox Christians. We're grateful to Father Michael Varlamos and Athanasios Yamenos for sifting through encyclicals, scholarly works, historic documents, and letters, and sharing the information in their excellent papers so we could share them with you. You can find them on our sources page on our website. Thanks for listening. Greek Like Me is a Stealth Greek production. This episode was researched, written, and narrated by me, your host, Pamela Dowdies Wood. Our producer, photographer, and post-production editor is Douglas John. Visit our website at stealthgreek.com for resources, photos, links, and more. Please rate, like, and subscribe. It helps us get noticed so we can keep making content about Greeks and Greek culture. You can find us on Facebook and Instagram at Greek_like_me. See you next time. Yes, us.